Herb and Ellie Foster's comfy old farmhouse in Santa Cruz was in many ways the heart of the neighborhood, and over the years it probably hosted more potlucks, community meetings, and teenagers hanging out than all the other houses on the block combined. So when their kids grew up, moved out, and the stairs became too much for the couple to navigate, Herb and Ellie's first instinct was to figure out how to stay in the community they had lived in since 1958. David, once your folks realized that the house that they had lived in for decades was no longer a good fit, what did they do to try to stay in the neighborhood?
Well, I think part of the thing about this house is that it is big. It's rambling. Yeah. I mean, big in those days. It was 1,600 square feet, which nowadays is small, I guess. But it had 4 bedrooms, and they really didn't need 4 bedrooms. My mom couldn't get up the stairs, and so they were looking for alternatives. And my dad had done some construction before in his, earlier life, and so he was thinking, let's build a granny unit. And he went down to the city to find out how to go through that process. And it was just daunting. It was just made the whole thing impossible. It required a public hearing. All of the neighbors would have to be notified. It was totally, up to what the reaction from the neighborhood was going to be, whether it would be possible or not. At that time also, it required so much parking that basically you'd end up having to pave half of your backyard to make, for the extra parking spaces that were required. So it became such a burdensome process that they just threw up their hands. And he had drawn up some early plans of how he'd like to do it, and it went down to the planning department, and it was just a confusing mess that where they just said it's not going to work. So they eventually moved out. We purchased the house from them, and they moved to downtown Santa Cruz to a small apartment.
What were the realities of the zoning regulations in Santa Cruz concerning accessory dwelling units versus the laws themselves? Was it sort of a don't ask, don't tell policy?
I think ever since World War II, I guess, is when the big building boom happened, and people started saying, we really want our residential neighborhoods to be, for the perfect little houses with the picket fences and things. And they were very opposed to the idea of having granny units there. Before that time, it was very commonplace to have them. So they were very restrictive, and it simply wasn't talked about in the code that this was something that was allowed. So it was a very daunting, difficult task. They had huge setbacks that you had to meet, large a number of parking spaces that you had to provide. I think it was even covered parking spaces that had to be provided. They had also this public hearing process that you had to go through, and then large fees on top of that. So it just, all of those things together made it very, very difficult. And so the answer was that people simply said, I'm not going to go and get a use permit for this. I'm just going to convert my garage and do these things and be quiet about it. And so Santa Cruz, like many cities across California, had this proliferation of illegal granny units. And some of them were properly built, and some of them, were using, extension cords out the back to get the heating going, and were not meeting health and safety codes. They'd convert garages that had, the water heater still in the main room with not the proper ventilation and that kind of thing.
One of the prime movers in getting the city of Santa Cruz to change its land use ordinances was a local group called AHA, which you were very much involved with. What motivated you to get involved in this group and eventually change the law?
Well, I think, my background really is in affordable housing development. So I've always been an affordable housing advocate and working in that direction. But I think what's happened to us as a country, and especially here in California, is that affordable housing development has become very, very complex. The financing is complex. It takes years to get a good project going. And so it's kind of been taken away from the hands of the local people. It's confusing. There's no way to support it. And we finally found something, I think, that fit, that was local, that could be put together by local, one house at a time.
David, how does one go about creating a constituency or organizing a community?
We started with just kind of calling friends that we knew were interested in granny units. We had one city council member that was very supportive and had talked about it before in the past, and so we met with him. We just kind of gathered people together that had an interest in doing this. And Carol Berg with the city, we invited her to a potluck dinner and just had 5 or 6 people show up. And the next meeting there were 20 people. And it really took off, that people saw this as an exciting way that they could get involved in building something locally.
Can you give us an overview of AHA's long-term goals? Was it something that you had in mind all along, or was it something that evolved over time?
Well, AHA stands for Affordable Housing Advocates, and we put the exclamation at the end of it to make it AHA. And really the idea was that there needed to be a group that could be an advocate for affordable housing locally, and especially kind of the idea of green building and sustainable smart growth building. And then we kind of picked on affordable housing or granny units, accessory dwelling units, as one of the special things that we were interested in, and something that we felt we had a chance of getting some real change.
So how does Joe citizen or Jane citizen go about approaching City Hall? Seems pretty daunting.
I think that a lot of us looked for different ways to go about doing this. The first thing that we did was we wrote a kind of a position paper about accessory dwelling units and started passing that around, bringing it to the city council members. And then once AHA got together, we started writing letters to the editor. The city council was having an election, so we made sure that there was a forum to talk about granny units and about affordable housing. And it wasn't even an issue of the campaign until all of a sudden they showed up at this forum and needed to have some answers. So they started listening to what we were saying. And it kind of bloomed from there. A number of us got on the planning commission and started getting involved more that way.
So how do you make the people in City Hall your allies rather than your enemies?
Well, I think for Santa Cruz, they realized that they had a problem with granny units that were illegal, and they didn't know, what was the best way to do this. If you enforce the current program and you end up with people moved out onto the street, and we already have a fairly significant homeless population here, we certainly didn't want to move in that direction. So they were looking for a good alternative. And here we had a very reasoned process. Here's the way that you can legalize those units, make your ordinance a little easier to get along with, and you can also build some additional affordable housing while you're at it. And so they kind of saw that as a positive thing. I think one of the big things with city government is don't bring problems to your city council, bring solutions to them. And that's really what we did. And it made it easy for them to say, hey, that makes sense. We could actually support that.
Give us a sense of the changes that were made in the zoning codes of the city of Santa Cruz as a result of your efforts.
Okay, so for our case here, what really made it possible for us, and some of these happened because of our advocacy, and some of it happened because of state law that changed. But basically what the city's new ordinance allowed was that they would waive the requirement for covered parking. They allowed us to put our parking in tandem, one car in front of the other, to meet the minimum requirement of parking. They allowed us to reduce the setbacks. We have 3-foot setbacks on one side now. On top of that, the city, biggest and most important was they didn't require a public hearing anymore.
I understand the city even offered pre-approved plans.
One of the things that I thought was really good was to realize that granny units were going to be built not by professional contractors and big-time developers, but by homeowners that said, hey, wouldn't it be great to do this? So it needed to be really user-friendly. And that meant, you know, not just simple wording, but the city went out of its way and produced a manual, and they produced a demonstration book that had 5 or 6 different sample architectural plans that were pre-approved for the granny unit. You could look through the book, pick what you want, and move with that, and not have the added expense of an architect even involved. So it made it much easier for people to jump right in and get involved in the process.
David, do you get the sense that sometimes zoning laws are in a bit of a time warp?
Well, I mean, I totally agree. I think one of the amazing things is most of the general plans were originally built in the designed in the 1940s, and so we're still set in that mindset of what families were like at that time. And now we have the sandwich generations. We got people that a growing senior population that needs a way to stay connected with their community. We've got families that need childcare now that was never thought about before. And so we need to slowly bring those general plans, those housing elements, all of the codes in the communities up to modern day, so that they can accommodate the diversity of family and household types that we have today.
So what did you and your group in the city of Santa Cruz do to avoid a NIMBY backlash?
Well, I think one of the things that the city did was that they had a series of workshops about the granny unit ordinance. They had their demonstration of all of the architects coming to show their examples, and had participation, incredible participation from the community that came out, and that was over about a 6-month period.
David, have you got any parting thoughts or words of advice for someone who'd be interested in building a granny flat in their backyard, perhaps?
Well, I think one of the neat things is that you don't have to start from ground zero and reinvent this thing. I think there's some great examples out there now, and Santa Cruz is one of them, but they're all across the country where it really has helped. And I think your book is really going to show that there are good reasons for granny units, that they fit into neighborhoods properly. And so that's available. You don't have to start from the beginning. I just think also figuring out ways to have local people take control over the affordable housing issue and bring it into their own backyards is the way to move this whole idea forward and make our housing fit our needs better.
Are these Peruvian lilies here?
How did they cure this?
Yeah.